Welcome to my lecture on Middle East politics. I'm Dr. Bufano. This is going to be my 15th lecture on the region. And in today's lecture, we are going to talk about the Arab-Israeli wars. So in order to get to it, let me first just share my screen with you. All right, so in the previous lecture, so make sure to go back and watch it if you haven't done so, we talked about the origins of Zionism and why tens of thousands of Jews migrated from the Europe and different parts of the Middle East to Palestine. We also talked about how this settler colonialism ignited a conflict with the local Muslim Arab population, and this led to the emergence of Israeli and Palestinian nationalist movements that conflicted with each other. And now what we're going to discuss is how after World War II, we're going to see the emergence of the Arab-Israeli wars, a series of wars that took place between the neighboring Arab states and the newly created state of Israel starting in 1948. There were four major wars. So by the time this lecture ends, you should know what these four wars are, what caused them, and what their consequences were. The big consequence here is that eventually the Israelis are going to occupy all Palestinian territory. And eventually, towards the end, most Arab states are going to give up on this idea of being able to confront the Israelis militarily. In fact, most of them are going to eventually give up on the Palestinian cause, even though, of course, most of the Arab masses continue to support Palestine very passionately. We're also going to understand in the process how the Cold War impacted these conflicts. So the United States is going to play a critical role in these wars, as is the Soviet Union. You're going to find out why America has come to so strongly support the Israeli states. And finally, we're going to understand why and how the Israelis occupied all Palestinian territory. So let's get to it. All right, the first war here. So we learned from last lecture how Palestine was established as a British mandate after World War I. Because of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the San Remo Agreement, the Arab states of the former Ottoman Empire were divided up into new territories, one of which was Palestine. And from 1920 all the way up until 1948, Palestine was technically ruled by the British, although the British were increasingly losing their control of this colony from the 1930s to the 1940s. And really, World War II was the breaking point. This is a war that was devastating for Europe, and it's going to lead to the decline of the British and French empires in its aftermath. And so after 1945, the British decided to leave it up to the newly created United Nations to decide the fate of Palestine. Now, the British had promised the Arabs that they weren't going to create two new states. They weren't going to give the Jews their own state in Palestine. But after World War II, they decided to leave it up to the United States, United Nations to decide this question. Will there just be one state for both Jews and Muslims, as well as Christians who lived in Palestine, or are there going to be two states, one for the Israelis and one for the Palestinians? And of course, what the United Nations ended up deciding to do was to divide this country into two states, into Palestine and Israel in 1947. Now, a big reason for this decision is that within the United States, there was a lot of growing sympathy for the Jewish cause. The devastation of the Holocaust, for one, created a lot of sympathy for the Jews, not only within the United States, but within other countries throughout the globe. And on top of that as well, you had a lot of Jews that migrated from Europe to the United States, and they were lobbying, trying to influence the American government. On top of that as well, you had a lot of what we call Christian Zionists within the Protestant Christian world who believed that the only way for Jesus to return, for the Messiah to return, was for the Jews to take back control of the Holy Land. So you had a lot of these different reasons. And on top of that, many within the United States and within the West saw Israel as a potential ally in the upcoming Cold War. So thus, the decision came to split Palestine and Israel into two countries. And what happened as a consequence of this? Well, you're going to see mass protests across the Arab world. If you remember from 2 lectures ago, we talked about the emergence of Arab nationalism. There was this growing anger in the Arab street towards the British and French, towards the West, towards the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the San Remo Agreement. This division of the Arab world into different states created mass anger. And so in response to this, there was lots of protests across the Arab world. And thus, as a consequence of this, states in the Arab world, such as Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, they felt a lot of pressure from their populations to do something about this. Now, this was at a time that these states had yet to be overthrown by Arab nationalists, right? Those coups of the 1950s and 60s had yet to take place. These were still governments that had been set up due to the Sykes-Picot and San Remo agreements. You had these constitutional monarchies like Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan that still had a lot of ties to the West, but they were feeling this pressure from the Arab street below. And they realized if they wanted to keep their legitimacy, they were going to have to do something about the establishment of the Israeli state. So in 1948, these 5 states decide they're going to try to invade Israel and prevent its formation. And so this was a way for them to win legitimacy with the masses. Now, here's the thing, though. These countries remained underdeveloped economically. They were still highly dependent on agriculture. They had relatively weak militaries. They had still been very dependent at the time on the British and French to protect their sovereignty. So these very weak states, they're going to struggle in this war. And on top of that as well, they also struggled to coordinate against the Israelis. So they were poorly funded, their militaries, and they performed poorly. And on top of that, the monarchies of the region kind of went about this in a half-hearted way. They weren't really enthusiastic about this conflict. In the first place, it was really the Arab masses from down below, the social movement activists, the Arab nationalists, the Islamists that were really motivated to fight this conflict. But for these Arab states, they were not exactly very enthusiastic. And so what's going to end up happening is they're going to struggle to coordinate, and they're going to struggle to perform here militarily. And on top of that, even though the Israelis were technically outnumbered here, they are going to receive financial support and military aid, particularly from France, Great Britain, and the United States. Substantial aid is going to come from these countries. And over time, Israel is going to become a very strong ally of the United States. And so what happens? The Israelis are going to win this war, right? So this was the original UN partition plan of 1947. As you can see, the idea was to create 2 states for 2 peoples, the Israelis, the Palestinians. Now, what's going to happen is the Arabs are going to invade first, right? So the Arabs are going to attack in this war first to prevent the formation of this new states. And initially, they're going to gain some lands here, but the Israelis are going to strike back with a lot of Western support. What's going to happen is they're going to take a lot of the territory that was given to the Palestinians in this initial 1947 plan. And on top of that, the Jordanians and the Egyptians are going to invade these 2 territories that we call the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so as a result, the Israelis are going to win this war, okay? And it's going to lead to the establishment of the Israeli states. And as you can see here, Israel to this day still receives substantial aid from the United States. From 1946 to 2016, they received over 90 billion worth in military aid, over 34 billion in economic aid. And this remains until this very day. And so the aid right now sits at approximately $4 billion a year. So they remain a very strong U.S. ally. Now, what was the consequence of this war? So as you can see here, this war is titled by Arabs as the Nakba, which means the great disaster. And a disaster it was for the Palestinians. Israel took control of more land. Now, they didn't occupy all of the land that was meant for Palestine, but they did take a lot of control of the land. They also as well destroyed a lot of villages. There's going to be a lot of massacres committed. Lots of refugees are going to be created as a result. Now, the Gaza Strip. So this is this little strip of territory on the Mediterranean, and the main city within this strip is called Gaza. They're going to be occupied by the Egyptians. And a lot of Palestinian refugees from other Palestinian lands are going to flood into the Gaza Strip, making it very overcrowded. And so Egypt's going to occupy it. Now, the West Bank is going to be occupied by the Jordanians. And so it's called the West Bank because it's west of the Jordan River, the bank of the river. So the West Bank. And so the Jordanians are going to occupy it. In fact, the reason why Jordan changed its name from Transjordan to Jordan is because there was a time period where they ruled over this territory on both sides of the Jordan River. So they just get rid of this title Trans, and they just call themselves Jordan after this. And Palestinians are going to have no state of their own. In fact, this is going to create a massive refugee crisis where we're going to see Palestinians be forced from their lands. Many of them are going to go to Jordan. In fact, about half of Jordan's population today consists of people of Palestinian descent. So lots of instability created by this, lots of people driven into poverty and desperation. And thus, it gets titled the Nakba. So it's a catastrophe, a great disaster for the Palestinians and those who supported their causes. And in the process, the Arab states that participated lost much of their legitimacy. These Western-backed monarchies and republics throughout the region, they're going to lose a lot of support from the Arab masses. So there was already mass anger at them to begin with, but now their foundations are going to become even shakier. So a war that was meant to try to gain the legitimacy of the Arab masses is actually going to help these countries collapse. So the first of these collapses actually took place in the Syrian Republic. It was overthrown in a coup in 1949. Syria is going to experience over a dozen coups and attempted coups over the next 2 decades, leading eventually to the Ba'ath Party gaining power. And of course, Egypt's monarchy was overthrown in 1952 by Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Free Officers. We talked about this a couple of classes ago. Iraq's Hashemite monarchy was overthrown in a coup in 1958. And once again, Arab nationalists are going to take control. And, even Jordan, even though Jordan's monarchy is going to survive, there was a failed coup attempt there as well. And so these coup attempts were led by mainly Arab nationalist officers, people who are sympathetic to this left-wing Arab nationalist cause of uniting the Arab world against European colonialism and the Israeli states. And so here we could see what happens. Jordan is going to occupy the West Bank here. The Egyptians are going to occupy the Gaza Strip, and the Israelis are going to gain territory. And, of course, it's seen as a Nakba because of just, the civilian casualties, the refugees. Over 750,000 Palestinians were displaced by this. Over 13,000 people were killed. Over 500 villages were destroyed. Okay, and so what's going to happen here is that you're going to see the expansion of Israeli territory. But the Arab states are not going to give up on the cause. In fact, their support for Palestine is only going to grow after this. And the big leader of the Arab nationalists is going to be Gamal Abdel Nasser. We learned a couple of classes ago how he seized power in Egypt in 1952 with the military coup with the Free Officers. And he's going to centralize control over this country, and eventually he's going to really fully embrace Arab nationalism as well as socialism. He's going to build up ties with the Soviet Union. He's going to build up his military with aid coming from the capitalist bloc. He's also as well going to promote socialist policies. He's going to nationalize much of the economy. He's going to kick the Europeans out of the country. So most of the Europeans are going to lose their lands as well as their businesses here. And he's going to create these state-run factories. So Egypt is going to really fall under the Eastern orbit here. He's going to receive a lot of support from the Soviet Union as a way to try to push back against British and French influence in his country. And in fact, part of what really drove Nasser closer to the Soviet Union here is he had a lot of these developmental projects he wanted to do. One of the things he wanted to do to bring electricity to Egypt was build the Aswan Dam in southern Egypt along the Nile River. So the way the Nile River flows, it flows from the south to the north. And so thus he wanted to use that flow to create electrical generators that would then give power to cities like Cairo and Alexandria. And of course, this dam would be expensive, right? And it would require a lot of technical expertise. He turned to the World Bank and the United States, but they turned him down mainly because of his anti-Israeli stance and because he was increasingly embracing socialism and these land reforms that were redistributing wealth. So thus, he turns to the Soviet Union for help. And they give him help. They help him build this dam. They start to help him in terms of weaponry. And eventually, as well, on top of getting this dam built, he decides he wants to nationalize the Suez Canal. That is, take over the canal zone. We talked about this canal in a previous lecture here. This is the canal itself today. About a third of the world's trade runs through it. It's critical for getting goods from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean in a much faster manner than going around the entire African continent. So very important canal zone. And before 1956, going all the way back to the 1870s, this canal had been controlled by British and French influence. And in fact, they had a large stake in the canal. So in 1956, Nasser decides, because he has the support of the Soviet Union here, he's going to kick the British and French out of the canal zone. And of course, the British and French did not like this very much. And the Israelis felt threatened by this, right? Suddenly Nasser, he's this charismatic figure. His power is growing. His influence is growing. He's spreading Arab nationalism on the radio to much of the rest of the region. And on top of this as well, he's kicking the British and French out of the canal zone. And so the Israelis, they start to panic. And so they start to have these secret communications with the British and French. And they make a decision. They are going to take back the canal zone. And so what they agree on doing is the Israelis would first invade the Suez Canal region. And they would do so on the basis that, the Arabs had invaded them first in 1948. Therefore, they were going to invade the Sinai region and the Suez Canal region. And then from there, the British and French would use that as an excuse to occupy the canal zone so as to keep the canal secure for the international community. So basically, it was a secret agreement between these three countries to justify invading the Sinai and the Suez Canal zone. And here's the thing. They did this without telling the United States here. Okay, and you're going to see why this is a big deal in a second. So what happens, these three countries in 1956, after Nasser nationalizes the canal, they invade the Sinai region and the Suez Canal region. So the Soviet Union, because, as I said, Nasser had developed strong ties with them, they threatened nuclear war. This was during the time of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were trying to expand their influence to different countries in the world. And they were both nuclear powers. And so the Soviet Union says, get out or we're going to war. And so the United States in turn panics, right? The United States doesn't want a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And at the time as well, the Soviet Union was helping the British and French rebuild their economies after World War II. The US also had troops in Western Europe, and they were kind of angry with the British and French, for not letting the United States in on their plan. They would have probably advised them against it. And so the United States tells Britain, France, and Israel to leave Egypt. Okay, they don't want to have a nuclear war here. And so the US as well, in the process, they basically established their supremacy over Britain and France. So while, of course, the British and French were American allies during the Cold War, right? They were a part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The US, by doing this, was essentially establishing its hegemony over NATO. It was saying, I am the top dog here, all right? Colonization is supposed to be coming to an end, all right? The US is supposed to be the top dog within NATO. You are a declining power. get out of Egypt. So basically, this was the US putting Britain and France in its place. And it was embarrassing for the British and French. They were suddenly second tier to the United States here. And on top of this as well, while they were an ally with Israel, they did not want to risk a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So basically, they tell these countries get out of the canal zone. So they wanted to avoid a nuclear war here. And here, this just kind of shows you the map layout here of what happened. Here's Egypt to the left. You can see the Nile River in Cairo. Down in the far south, this is where the Nasser Dam was built, the Aswan Dam in the far south. And we can see here, this is the canal zone with the cities of Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez. And this is the Sinai Peninsula, and then here's Israel. So essentially what happened is Israel sends in troops into the Sinai and then towards the canal zone. And then the British and French sent paratroopers. They dropped them down into the canal zone and tried to occupy it. The Egyptians put up stiff resistance. There was a lot of bloodshed and fighting. But ultimately, the British and French and the Israelis succeeded in occupying this area. It's the Soviet Union that comes in and tells them to get out. And of course, what ends up happening is that Gamal Abdel Nasser comes out looking great out of this. He's going to come out of this as a hero, right? He's going to successfully nationalize the Suez Canal with the help of the communist bloc. So this is a big shift in power relations internationally. And so thus, this is going to really accelerate the growth of Arab nationalism. It's why you're going to have a lot of the Arab nationalist coups are going to come after this. The Ba'ath Party is going to take control of Syria and Iraq eventually. So it's going to reach its height of popularity, right? A lot of euphoria in the Arab world. This was the first big victory against the Israelis. It was also the first really big victory of the Arabs against the West here, right? And eventually as well, they're going to have a victory in Algeria. They're going to support the Algerian cause, as we talked about a couple of classes ago. And Nasser, he's going to be able to fully centralize control of Egypt after this. He's going to become like a god there. He's going to create a single party, socialist, Arab nationalist dictatorship here. And he's going to eventually nationalize most of the Egyptian economy in the process. He's going to model his government a lot off of what was happening in the Soviet Union and other parts of the communist bloc at this time. So he's really going to become this big hero. And in the process, Arab nationalism as this cultural and political movement is going to take off in a lot of other Arab countries. So he becomes super popular. And, just about everywhere, either these coups are going to succeed, these Arab nationalist coups, or they're going to be attempted in places like Jordan. So the Arab masses really come to support Abdel Nasser here. And in fact, this is also when there were a couple of those failed unions we talked about 2 classes ago, right? Very briefly, Egypt and Syria form a single country from 1958 and 1961. And then he attempts to form this union with northern Yemen from 1961 to 1967. He's actually going to become bogged down in the civil war there, where he's going to support the Arab nationalists, and his great enemy, the Saudis, they're going to support the conservatives in northern Yemen, the monarchists. So very long, brutal conflict there. And so here's Gamal Abdel Nasser, right, the voice of Arab nationalism. He drew these large crowds. He's going to become very popular here. And so we're thus going to see this kind of Cold War in the Middle East, where American allies such as Turkey, Israel, to less of an extent, Saudi Arabia. We'll talk more about that in a second. And at the time, believe it or not, Iran, we'll talk more about why Iran was a U.S. ally before 1979 in a later lecture. They're going to be engaged in a struggle with the Arab republics of the region, these kind of Arab nationalist states like Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, over control of the Middle East. And they're going to have the backing of the Soviet Union. So Nasser was initially riding high, but things are going to take a turn for the worst very quickly. Part of the problem here is that, as you might know from your basic world history, the communist policies of the Soviet bloc, these kind of command economies with, single party domination and the government controlling the entire economy, did not work out well economically. Nasser's, far left authoritarian socialist policies, they're going to fail to create much in the way of economic growth. His new factories are going to be very inefficient. They're not going to be able to produce high quality goods. So the economy is not going to grow very well. On top of that, Nasser's going to fail to unite Arab countries as a single country. He had these failed unions with Syria and northern Yemen. There are going to be a lot of countries in the Arab world that are not going to support Arab nationalism. Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf are going to remain these very conservative monarchies with a lot of ties to the West. So they're not going to be in favor of these unions with Egypt. And on top of that as well, the Israelis are going to put up stiff resistance to the Arab world. And in fact, Egypt drained itself of resources, giving a lot of aid first to Algeria from 1954 to 62, and then he's going to drain a lot of resources in Yemen. In fact, the Egyptians are going to spend a ton of money on their own military as well as military aid to other states, taking away money from economic development. So the states that participated in the Arab-Israeli wars, their economies really got hit hard by this. And eventually, just Nasser is not going to be able to afford it anymore. In 1967, he's going to be forced to pull his troops out of Yemen, ending this experiment with this union with northern Yemen. And what he's going to do, so he's going to justify this, right? He's going to make it seem like he's pulling these troops out of there because he's going to stand up more to the Israeli state. So what he does is he places these troops on the Israeli border. Now, at the time, there had been these UN peacekeepers there trying to keep the peace between Egypt and Israel. He's going to force these UN peacekeepers to leave, and he's going to move these troops on the Israeli border. Now, this was a bluff. Basically, Nasser was saying he was going to get ready to invade. He was standing up to the Israelis. He had no plans on doing this. He knew that his economy was weak, that he would struggle in a conflict with the Israelis. So he was bluffing. But the Israelis did not take it as a bluff. They took it as a threat to their sovereignty. And the Israelis panic, okay? And so Nasser, he was threatening war with Israel. In fact, he also attempted to blockade the Gulf of Aqaba. This is where the Israelis have access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And so Nasser, he's making these bluffs here. He's puffing his chest out. He's trying to, keep up his image as the head of the Arab world, despite these recent setbacks, right, with his failed unions, his failed economic policies, being forced to leave Yemen. And so the Israelis, though, they take it as a threat. And what they decide to do is engage in this mass strike against the Arab enemies on their borders. They are going to, in a very rapid attack Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And these countries were not prepared for an actual war. As I said, Nasser was bluffing. And so what they're going to do in 1967 is in 6 days, they're going to occupy all Palestinian territories, as well as some Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian territory here. So they were not prepared for this. In fact, they were badly prepared for this conflict. And so this was known as the 6 Days War because of how quick it lasted. In fact, there was a lot of incompetence here. For example, the Egyptian Air Force at this time, they had this habit when they were doing drills of having all their aircraft, their Air Force drills, of having all their aircraft take off at the same time and then land at the same time in a very repetitive manner day by day. Now, you might be saying, why is that a problem? Well, the Israelis found out about this and they realized the best time to attack is when their aircraft are on the ground, because then you can bomb all their aircraft. This is why they took out the Air Force of not only the Egyptians, but the Syrians and Jordanians in a single day. And from there, without any air cover, the forces on the ground were basically screwed. Okay. And so the Israelis, they have this massive victory. And thus we get this second disaster, which is known as the Nakba. Okay. Israel occupies all Palestinian territories. So they kick the Egyptians out of the Gaza Strip and the Jordanians out of the West Bank, and they occupy all of those territories in only 6 days. The very fact that it's called the 6 Day War should tell you this was an embarrassment of massive, massive proportions. It created this massive refugee crisis, even worse than the 1948 war. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are forced into Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere abroad. So big disaster here. So the setback, big problem here. By the way, this term, the setback, seems kind of lighter than the catastrophe. This was Nasser's kind of framing on it. Just it was a setback, right? But the reality is that this was just a complete and total catastrophe for those Arab states. In the process, in Syria, Israel occupies this area called the Golan Heights. It's where Syria borders Israel. It's these highlands. The Israelis wanted to take this to have a better defensive position. They still occupy it till this day, the Golan Heights. The Israelis are also going to occupy the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Now, eventually, they're going to give this back, but for over a decade, they are going to occupy the Sinai Peninsula. And on top of this as well, the port cities on the Suez of Port Said, of Suez, of Ismailia are going to get destroyed. It's going to lead to Egyptian refugees, tens of thousands of them, flooding into Cairo. And they're going to build these shanty towns on the outskirts of Cairo. It's just going to lead to this massive disaster for something that the Egyptians are really never going to recover from economically or politically here. And in the process, Arab nationalism, support for it politically, is going to collapse. Of course, Arab identity is still important, but Arab nationalism is never really going to recover from this after 1967. And the refugees, for their part, they are just going to flee, okay, the incoming Israeli onslaught. So just a disaster all around here. And Nasser, he's going to suffer from heart problems. He's going to die 3 years later in 1970 with this really mixed legacy. So while some Arabs and Egyptians remember him as a hero, others also remember this catastrophe and his failed economic and political policies. And so thus, there's a lot of people who despise Nasser as a consequence. So here, the 6-Day War here, the Israelis occupy the Sinai Peninsula. They occupy the Golan Heights, as well as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So really just a disaster. Since 1967, by the way, the Israelis have occupied Palestinian territories. So this left its mark on the region. Now, our last war. And so, what is going to lead to the end of the Arab-Israeli wars? So after Nasser dies here, he's going to be replaced by his vice president, Anwar Sadat, who, in fact, Anwar Sadat was someone who was chosen as Nasser's vice president because he didn't have a big social base of support. In fact, he wasn't even really a true Arab nationalist. He was someone that was, more closer to Islamism, and he also, as well, had some pro-Western sympathies for capitalism. He was chosen as Nasser's vice president precisely because he was weak. He didn't want someone below him that would try to overthrow him. But when Sadat comes into power, he's going to want to shift Egypt from the Soviet camp to the Western camp. He realized Nasser's policies weren't working. He wanted to go to the United States, and he also wanted to make peace with Israel in order to get the Sinai back, right? And so he wanted to switch sides in the Cold War. And in fact, you're going to see a lot of other Arab states after this, due to a lot of the failures of Arab nationalism, they're going to start to shift to the United States in the aftermath of this. So Sadat, he wants to switch sides in the Cold War, but there was one big problem. He needed to justify peace negotiations with the Israelis. Remember, most of the Arab street still hates the Israelis. They can't stand them. There's also a lot of anti-Western attitudes. He has to be able to justify negotiating with the Israelis, and he also needs to gain the pride back of the Egyptian military. I mean, the state was hit hard by this, and the Egyptian government was suffering. There were fears of a coup. There was fears of a revolution. He realized he needed to gain the Egyptian military's pride back and win back the legitimacy of the public so that he could engage in these negotiations with the Israelis. So one of the things that Sadat does is he starts to restock the Egyptian military with weapons, and he starts to buy weapons from Czechoslovakia. They were part of the communist bloc. He begins to rearm the Egyptian military. And what he does is he plans this sneak attack with the state of Syria. So the idea is, the big hope is that they could gain the Sinai and the Golan Heights back, but really Sadat knew this was not very realistic. What he wanted to do was to engage in a sneak attack to, show the Israelis that they could still fight, that they weren't weak, that they could stand up to the Israelis and have some success on the battlefield. And he also wanted to have the basis to restart negotiations on a better footing, right? Because with the Israelis riding high, he felt that the Israelis weren't going to give in to any of Sadat's demands, right? So he wanted to be able to negotiate with these people. So they engage in a sneak attack in 1973, hence the 1973 war. And it was also known as the Yom Kippur War. And the reason why is because the sneak attack was planned. There were two holidays that were happening simultaneously at this time. The holiday of Ramadan was happening. And if you remember from a prior lecture, Ramadan is when Muslims fast. And so the Israelis weren't really expecting an attack during Ramadan. And on top of that, the most important Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was also taking place. And so this was a very important holiday for the Jews. A lot of Israeli soldiers were on holiday. So they planned this sneak attack, and they did it really well. They did it really under the nose of the Israelis. And so thus, Israel was taken by surprise, and they were surprised by how well the Egyptian military fought. They gained a lot of their pride back, the Egyptian military, as a consequence of this. And they put up stiff fighting here. There were lots of casualties. Unlike it didn't last 6 days, right? This lasted over a month. Lots of casualties on the Israeli side. The Israelis were surprised by this, and they kind of came to realize maybe we're not quite as dominant as we thought we were here. And on top of this as well, another big factor here is that in 1969, a lot of the Arab Gulf states, and we're going to talk about this a little later, such as Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, they're going to gain their independence from the British. These little oil emirates, these little oil kingdoms. And when they gain their independence, they're going to create this new organization with Saudi Arabia called OPEC that is going to try to control the world supply of oil to increase oil revenues. And what OPEC decided to do is they wanted one big show of strength to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they could shut off the oil supply whenever they wanted to. They wanted to increase the world's oil prices. And they decided they were going to use this 1973 war to their advantage as way as well to kind of whip up support from the masses in the Arab street. And so, although Saudi Arabia was a U.S. ally, they decided to engage in this embargo to increase their political power. And so thus, they shut off the supply of oil to the rest of the world. The price of oil skyrockets in 1973, hitting the West hard. Okay, and I mean hard. The economy took a downturn. It's going to lead to a lot of unemployment in the United States, this period of stagflation. It's going to hurt the Nixon presidency in the process. And so thus, suddenly there's a lot of pressure on the West, maybe to start putting pressure on Israel to maybe negotiate more with Arab states and try to find some room for compromise here. And so oil prices skyrocket across the world. Now, I do have to let you know here, let's keep in mind that this was only a temporary tactic. The reality is that the Arab Gulf couldn't do this forever, right? They still needed the West to buy their oil. So Saudi Arabia was still dependent on the United States for its military support. But it did demonstrate that the Arab Gulf had more power, right, than they had before. And so thus, what it's going to lead to here is, more open negotiations. Now, last but not least, Sadat had yet to switch sides in the Cold War here. And so the Soviet Union, they're going to once again threaten nuclear war, just to add on top of this. So what's going to happen is the Americans are going to pressure the Israelis to go to the negotiation table. So now it is also important to keep in mind the Egyptians are not going to take the Sinai back by force militarily. The U.S. is going to step in and give some help to the Israelis. They are going to push the Egyptians back to the Canal Zone, but the U.S. is going to put pressure on the Israelis to engage in negotiations. And so what was the consequence of the Yom Kippur War? The Egyptians did not win the war militarily, okay? But this is the big but. they regained their pride and ability to negotiate. Okay, so a big important aspect of all of this here. They were able to renegotiate with the Israelis. And thus, this led to what is called the Camp David Accords. Over the course of the next 6 years, Egypt and Israel would first secretly negotiate. Sadat didn't want to let the rest of the Arab world know he was doing this. Okay, but what he started to do is he started to negotiate with the United States. And even before a final deal was hammered out, he is going to start to open up to more trade with the United States. He's going to start to open the economy up. He's going to start to engage in more diplomacy. He is going to start as well to allow a lot of Western companies into the United States. And eventually, all of this is going to lead to a peace agreement. He's going to come out into the open with it. In 1979, he becomes the first Arab state, so Sadat and the Egyptians, the first Arab state to sign an agreement with the Israelis. It's known as the Camp David Accords. It was negotiated with the help of Jimmy Carter, who was then president. And so what the agreement was that Egypt would regain the Sinai and they would obtain $2 billion a year in U.S. aid. So very important here. So they would get help from the United States to rebuild their economy, rebuild their agricultural sector, to try to rebuild their cities. So lots of U.S. aid would come in. They would regain the Sinai, and in return, Egypt would recognize the state of Israel. So this was a peace agreement, and they would also open up to trade to the West and promise the West that they would have permanent access to the Suez Canal, right? That they would be able to use it. And so, thus, what happens is Egypt makes this a peace agreement. Now, at first, Egypt was temporarily kicked out of the Arab League. There was a lot of angry states here. But over time, one Arab state after another is going to start to warm up to the Israelis. Some states like Jordan are going to sign peace agreements. Later, other states, a couple of other states in the Arab Gulf are also going to sign peace agreements with the Israelis. And on top of that as well, even states like Saudi Arabia are going to secretly behind the scenes kind of warm up to the Israeli state. Egypt's going to be welcomed back into the Arab Union. And over time, support for Arab states is going to gradually decline. Now, some states are not going to turn to the United States and become allies. Syria, under the Ba'ath Party, under the Assad regime, is going to continue to be within, the Russian orbit over the next couple of decades. They're going to continue to be opposed to Israel. But a lot of the Arab states, they're going to move towards the West here. And this thus is the end of the Arab-Israeli wars. We are not going to see another attempt after this of the Arab states to try to unite to defeat Israel. So this 1973 war was the last of them. Now, with this said, the Arab masses are going to continue to support the Palestinians, though. And many individuals in the Arab street, they're going to start to turn away from Arab nationalism and towards Islamism as a consequence of this. So this is the Camp David Accords signed by it was negotiated with the help of Jimmy Carter and signed here by Anwar Sadat to the left, the new president of Egypt, and the Israeli prime minister here to the right. So the negotiations led to the Camp David Accords. And so here the Egyptians gained the Sinai back 3 years after this agreement. Israel's going to pull out all of their troops. But the Israelis still occupy the Golan Heights, as well as this series of farms in Lebanon called the Sheba Farms, and they still occupy Palestinian territory. So this agreement did not help the Palestinians out at all. In fact, many Palestinians felt betrayed by the Egyptians and even betrayed by other Arab states in the region. Jordan is going to later sign a peace agreement, as you're going to find out next class. So, the end result here is that we are going to see the Palestinians, they're going to have to take matters into their own hands. So we're going to talk about that next lecture, as well as the civil war that's going to spread into Lebanon in the aftermath of this. Okay, so that's it for today's lecture. If you have any questions or comments for me, leave them in the comments below. I will see you guys next time.